My name is Abe Hendriks. I'm a postdoc at Utrecht University at the Copernicus Institute. And the team invited me to talk a bit more about like the book that Julius and myself edited over the last few years. It's been quite some time that we've been working on this project. And I think it's nice to talk a bit more about it. I'll talk a bit about the content, but also about the process, the project, and how I see it related, like in a wider, almost like ecosystem or wider, community of things happening around and in transitions. But first of all, I do want to give immediately also a shout out to Julius, who's not here, because he both kind of like founded the webinar series and then made me co-founding that. And to some extent, also the same counts for the book. He's on paternity leave or parental leave, so he's currently not working. But we'll see him around on various future occasions, including the transitions conferences all across. So what I thought, and I already mentioned before, what would be nice, I think, is to talk a little about like, okay, how did we get here? And well, what does it mean that the book's here? What's next? Where are we heading? And then when I talk about we, that's I'm going to interpret that in multiple ways. I'm going to interpret that both as the early careers, the transitions community, but also a bit about us as editors. But it will be clear throughout what I'm referring to. At least that's what I'm hoping and aiming for. But the idea for me was to kind of like start with like, okay, how did we get here? And as I already mentioned, is like there's quite a clear STRN related lineage. It's not like fully, I would not say like it's not kind of like but it's not kind of like controlled or managed in that way by the STRN, the Sustainability Transitions Research Network. But we saw that over the last like 10, 15 years, we've seen that NEST has been emerging as a community. And then a few years ago during the pandemic, NESTwebinar series emerged, was founded, as I mentioned, by Julius, and then he dragged very nicely us into it and to setting it up. And now we have the introduction to Sustainability Transitions Research Handbook as published by Cambridge University Press. And what make like, and I think it's good to flag it also a bit in this order. Like first we had NEST as a community with conferences. That's actually could have been on the slide as well, with the conferences where it starts like from, and then the webinar series turn to. And the question then is also like, so why do we want to highlight this? Is I think like, well, we've seen that over the last years, the field has been growing. It's beyond early institutions like the Dutch universities, where there's been quite a lot of work on it, and transitions as a term is everywhere. So I think that's something to realize. Like we have been working, NEST has been founded to kind of give early careers some kind of platform and talk to each other. The conference has been, I think, for many people, at least in my cohort, around my cohort, been very nicely, both in terms of academic collaborations, but also good friends, people who think and talk about transitions in very various different ways, but are in touch quite a lot on that. And I think the book, in that sense, is a next step to kind of almost emancipate or to make it possible to enter and to talk about transitions as such. And that is, I would say, like as the field has been growing, we have been moving beyond early institutions, but also regionally, no longer only in Northwestern Europe. And then as a term, it's everywhere. Like everything is in that sense often used or talked about as transitions, whereas from transition studies, we would not necessarily all classify as such. And that's something that other elements of the community are also quite explicit about. Then maybe a few words on like why us, and I think that's nice. I mentioned like I think for us it's really that we noticed like it's not being taken up by others. So we thought like, well, it would make sense. I was myself at Dutch University, but at the University of Groningen, where there are not that many people who are working with transitions, or and I found myself quite like sometimes searching like, how do I engage nicely with transitions without going to Utrecht or to Rotterdam all the time, although so people were still quite close by. But how do I kind of like make it possible to enter this differently. And that was a conversation that spurred with Julius in a nice way. And it's not being taken up by others. So that's something for us very important. Like, well, it's not necessarily that we thought like we are two guys that should do this, but it was not necessarily taking place. And discussing this also with others, yeah, we've been talking about why that makes sense to do that. Maybe one comment on that is that it's not very common that a handbook like this, and especially not when it's being initiated for the first time, is being initiated by two early careers. Like, I mean, right now, Julius is not that early career anymore, maybe mid-career, but back then it was definitely the case. And that was that because like no one else took it up, but also there was quite a lot of resonance within STRN. Like we have done the webinar series, we have organized both the conference for me was online with a group. We organized the Sofia edition that was online, and Julius organized the conference before. So we did play a role in there, and yeah, we have been in touch with, for instance, Jochen Markart, who has been initiating the handbook before, but not taking it up himself, or did not resonate that much to get it going, because it's an awful lot of work, I can tell you. And maybe if I would have known how much work, I would have thought about it twice, and also thought about maybe finishing a PhD before starting this. But for us, for both Julius and myself, it's something that we've been discussing quite a lot, is also the role of like, so who are we as academics? And I think there's something that I would highlight immediately also for other early careers and PhD students, is like it does make sense to think about like what is your role in academia? Are you kind of like the novelist, novel theorist? Are you always on cutting edge empirics? Or maybe you have a role as curator in organizing things like webinars, conferences, but also maybe organizing handbooks. And that does not mean that you're theoretically or empirically less developed, but it might just kind of also fit your skill set better, that you bring people together. And I think it's an important and distinct academic role that we should also maybe appreciate more now in times where large language models are also influencing the way that we communicate as academic communities. So I think that's very interesting to think about, what does it mean to be a curator? And I'm very happy to talk about that in the Q&A, because I don't see myself as a curator only, but I think it's something that in a wider sense, and also maybe in something to discuss. And as I mentioned, we've been in touch with, for instance, Jochen Markart on kind of like that there were already initial ideas, and we've learned a lot from the proposals that they've been writing in the 2010s on handbooks, but did not proceed with it. And we got a lot of backing by Paula Kivima, Lars Koenen, and Rob Raven, who especially in the early phases on like how to develop this. And what's been something that we've been also talking about, I think, over the last year, 2 years, quite a lot, is that we are then again two white guys from Northwestern Europe taking this up. Could it not have been a bit more diverse crowd? And the answer to that is definitely yes. We've tried quite explicitly within the transitions community to search for people who had the time and the capacity to take something up like this. And I think that's a bit of the double-edged sword that did not necessarily work out. And we could have done that in many ways, and in the end we decided to go with it this way, and did it our way, also on how to manage the rest of the book. And I'll get to that in a second, because it also reflects on how we have been talking, thinking, and engaging with the decisions and making during that time. So for us, it not necessarily has been much about like who are the two of us, but now why I do give it such quite an extensive background on who we are, the decisions we've made, is because I think it's something to reflect on myself, like what does this mean for the academic that I want to be, but also kind of like could be a path that for me in the early years of my PhD was not necessarily clear that this could be something to engage with so explicitly as well. So well, then the book, and I think it's we're very happy that the book is out. It has taken quite some time. So, but what does it mean? What is it about? Like, I mean, besides the fact that it's about transitions, I'm not going to recap kind of like the book in terms of like, well, this chapter is on this and this chapter is on this. But I do want to share kind of the background, the fact that we divided and decided like, well, we want a book that is accessible for many people who want to access the field, but also like we wanted to structure it in a way that it has a role to play. So we in the end made four different parts. The first part being understanding sustainability transitions, where the focus is really kind of on the more like the foundational works and frameworks that guides transitions like MLP, but also the work on technological and mission-oriented innovation systems, strategic niche management, and then following from that and transition governance, and then following from that after like kind of providing this foundation, also being aware like let's not stick to that too much in a way like let's not maybe that's not the right phrasing, but like let's not leave it there, or let's not only introduce kind of like theories or like these middle range theories, but also provide kind of like dimensions that are clearly present in analyzing and studying sustainability transition, but have been added also time-wise later on and are now kind of like full-fledged almost subfields of transitions like the geography, but also power politics and the dynamics like temporalities, like how can we understand these dimensions and bring it together. So these dimensions of transitions have been playing a role in there. After that, we thought like, well, we wanted to say something about how to study sustainability transitions. And we have a few kind of approach like that are more methodological, but they're not explicit methods. And finally, we have a section, and I will talk a bit longer on that part. What's like the idea of like how to look forward and what are future directions and challenges for transitions as a research field. And I would say like so there's a lot to say about this distinction, and I'm going to say a few things about it. It's like, well, we know it's not perfect. We know and we've tried to do it as good as possible. And I think we also did a decent job in that regard. And I think we have been reflecting on whether we did, and I think that's the conclusion there. But what is interesting is that when we talk about transitions, we talk about many different approaches, many different ways of understanding it. And if you create an artifact like a transition, like a handbook, and especially when you call it an introduction, then you do, whether you like it or not, play a role. You reproduce some kind of like structure, some kind of ideas. What's not necessarily a problem, but it is something that you do. And it has some form of policing role, whether you like it or not, and you can play with that. And I think we tried and we did that as well to some extent, but you definitely also reproduce particular ways of understanding transitions as foundations, like we did do that. And we also made it quite a explicit, I would say like explicit decisions on part 2 on dimensions could be 5 times the current size. I think also with the literature emerging over the last 5 to 10 years, but also simply like with the work that we did not include, but still think ourselves, for instance, is very interesting, is something to think about. Like, well, it's not that part 2 includes everything that either Julius, myself, or even other contributors would have liked, but there at some point we had to say, well, this is it, and we can't put everything in there. And there basically, I would say, bottom line, 2 reasons for, if you think like, well, why is this chapter not in there? Then the first reason to answer is like, well, this chapter is not in there because we finally made the cut. Like, okay, this is not in the first edition of this book. We decided to keep it out for content reasons or for how it fits together. And the second reason could be that we did not find experts or authorities on the topic to write about it. That did not happen too much, but it definitely has happened. And the third point here is on the methods, as I already mentioned, like we called it part 3, studying sustainability transitions. And that's for us really on ontology, epistemology, but also like approaches to, like it can be modeling, but we did not want to spell out like, well, how do you do a case study, or how do you do, how do you organize, kind of like didn't want to get too specific, because we should start the book as a whole, but also the way that we think about it really as an entry point. And the last point here is that we've made an attempt to mix all across the board, like a mix of senior and junior authors. We've asked senior authors to pair up with junior authors in some regards. We've also asked some colleagues from all over the world to work to see if they could work together with people they write together with people they have been working together from other parts of the world that is not Europe. So we've tried to diversify, and I think we again, we did not do a perfect job there, but we did definitely do an attempt and made some progress there. And that's interesting. Is also like, so who do you, if you organize like all these chapters together, it's interesting to keep kind of like to keep like, how do you keep a red thread? And I think for us, the one thing that helped us quite a lot is the way of like being clear about who's the audience. So we want the book to be there for graduate students, early career researchers. Basically, I would say almost only as a first or second meeting with transition studies, because after that, it should go, if I can say something like that, but it should not stick only to engaging with the book. But it should be like, okay, well, what is transition about? What is this theory or what's this approach about? Then reading about it, and then kind of like from this chapter, for instance, on geography, like reading on the literature more explicitly, but kind of like, yeah, being an entry point, being also maybe a gate for people who would not necessarily find their way into transitions easily themselves, that it would be and could be an interesting way, so an entry point really for both graduate students, ECRs, but also adjacent research fields. I think over the last year, what I've heard most since we've published the draft papers, but now the book is out there, is from supply chain. We've heard quite a few colleagues who are working in supply chain management, supply chain research, who are interested in transitions, and then start to look into the book and get through it. So that would be, I think, a good example of like having supply chain research colleagues who use the book as an entry point into transitions. So that's very brief, and if there are any particular questions about the book, about the book about the book itself, we can definitely also talk about that afterwards, because I think it's interesting to talk about it, but it can be also quite a bit particular for individuals. So future. So what's next? And I think that's maybe for us also as early career researchers, because I consider myself definitely for a few more years myself as an early career researcher as well. It would be the question like, well, where is the field of transition studies heading? What would be interesting questions and what not? And I'm not going to give a final answer, but I do think that the work that we have been doing together with Machteld Simons and Leo Frank, also the final chapter of the book, that we have kind of explored that question a little, and that might be interesting to talk about. So we have written this chapter between deep roots and a broad crown, Machteld, myself, and Leo, and the reflections on the development of sustainability transitions as a research field. And we used the metaphor of a tree, what it was quite used for ourselves to talk about it. Like every metaphor, it has its limitations, but I think that it makes sense to talk about it in that way. And as you all, or as most of you might like understand and know, is the trunk is kind of like developing a shared language. So when we talk about transitions, like the basis from the 1990s onwards, multi-level perspective, technological innovation systems, and so on, they have been developing a shared language, and they also have been developing a shared language to push back against. And I think particularly MLP has been functioned like that, especially talking about niche regimes. A lot of people have taken up the language of niche regimes, also to think and to engage with it, but not only to reproduce or to kind of like apply MLP analysis, but much more to structure the thinking. Based on evolutionary economics, STS, innovation studies. And the first, like I would say, decades was really about the organized knowledge and drew the field boundaries, where we saw kind of a middle range theories of meso level, or at least of change. I think that's an interesting starting point that we have decided, like, well, what that resonates a lot with what we've called part one in the book with understanding. It's kind of like the basis on which also many critiques, internal, sympathetic, and maybe also those who are not so sympathetic, have been critiquing the field for. From that, we kind of like focused both in research, but also like towards kind of the branches. So in terms of the tree, we have the trunk, and then we saw and that's partially it's the research that has been developed on what's been part two in the book, the dimensions, but it's also almost more fundamental. It has also shifted the question from focusing on socio-technical systems to socio-technical transitions to sustainability transitions, adding really this layer of sustainability. And that's something that, especially in part three, also comes back like, well, what does it mean? What role does it play? Because in MLP, regime change does not necessarily always mean or imply also regime change towards sustainability. Sustainability defined as radical transformation towards a sustainable society, what sustainability transitions as such, and system must change and the direction can be known. And I think that's something interesting that has changed there, that we recognized, and that's been recognized more often, but also for you might be relevant to realize, that the direction can be known, that we have something that we call like this, that makes a lot of sense to discuss that. So I've been reiterating this point, but I think this I would say, like, well, when Max approached me, like, well, would you think it's interesting, or would you want to talk or say something about the book? I thought, like, well, one thing that's interesting is to see how transitions studies or STR has been consolidated as a research field. That's not obviously not a net discipline, but it has been consolidated. And I've already said a few things about it. We have STRN, we have NEST, the community is open to early career and established scholars. STRN now also really having a secretariat that's established at our university, with really being kind of like institutionalized and becoming a community that's both, by internally kind of like accepted, but also increasingly externally. The research agenda from 2019, that's already 7 years ago, but I think that has been quite influential in also stating, well, what is the state of the art, but also what are our directions. Whenever I run into a Köhler et al. Reference, it's usually in the introduction of a paper stating why this paper makes sense, and that's often kind of like implicitly or explicitly underlying the power of this paper to be able to spot the future trends or things that could be spotted or could be developed and researched more. The Journal in Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions as a crucial transitions outlet is also related to kind of this almost, I don't like the metaphor of ecosystems. I already have the metaphor of the tree, but I don't know how to fit it in there. It's kind of like have the ICE Journal as a crucial transition outlet that is also very important in this. And with it, and also with these previous things, of course, I realize now that IST as a conference is not on the slide, but should have been and also used to be. And we've tried to kind of like add to that also as part, and I think it's worth to reflect on it, to consolidate the compiling the field shared body of theory and insights as what we have been trying to do as this handbook. So it's kind of a logical step, like, well, all right, it has been kind of almost exploding how much work has been done in the 2010s, early 2020s on transitions. Can we kind of like try to structure it in one way or another? Again, not in a definite way, but definitely also in a way that makes sense. And now I'm coming to what I find is also among the most interesting elements of what we wrote, what we found, and we found what we wrote in this chapter with Machteld and Leo is not only our own perspectives, but we run a survey across the STRN and NEST mailing list, and we also did, we read quite a few recent papers on people reflecting on the field, and they are all in that chapter. So some critique that might be worth it to talk about. First is, and I know like for some of you this will be quite clear, but the innovation bias was something that people kept bringing up. I think that the innovation bias has also been over the last year something that's been critiqued most, also in papers, and the continuing emphasis on technological innovation and assumptions of economic growth are quite central to be critiqued. Interestingly, I mean, since that we've been the literature on exnovation and also destabilization and the influence of the X curve and how other elements could and should be accounted for is really important. The second is, I think, and that's something that's very close to my own work and something that I found very interesting, is to talk about the uncritical use of sustainability as buzzword. It's not completely decoupled from the first point here, but the question is like, well, what does sustainability mean? How do we get to that? How do we decide that? And all of these kind of more explicitly political questions, talking about, well, where should regime change go? That's something like, what should sustainability be, and when can we call something sustainable and when not, and so on. That's something that's a debate that's often in adjacent fields, like in more like explicit transformations research, social ecological transformations research. It's more explicit where this is about, and it's more like politically grounded. And there's been quite some critique, I think, also from those who work on this intersection between transitions and transformations, that highlights this kind of uncritical use of sustainability as a buzzword. And the final point here is that we kind of like is the using concepts from other fields without appreciating scholars or debates. That's interesting, I think, from all over the board, is like people talking about geography, geographers engaging with transition sometimes complain about this, but also people working in power politics policy. Similarly, it's interesting to see how as a somewhat interdisciplinary field, if that's the label you want to give it, it sometimes struggles with like, how do I take established debates or established scholars quite serious and see also what's going on there, that we're not developing research in transitions based on the debates of 1 or 2 decades ago in other fields. A little more critique, and I think it's a little more critique, is the dominance of single case studies. I think also in ICE and in the journal editors or the previous journal editors have been highlighting that as well. Weak accumulation of evidence and a desire to move from describing change to explaining and even kind of like predicting it. And that's something that's been coming up quite a lot, the prediction or modeling what role it would play. And I think in part 3 we give it quite some attention in our book. But what I think, and that's also why what I will hope to discuss with you in a few minutes, is also to see, well, those critiques are also opportunities. Those are things that can be developed. I would even hope that kind of like, not in a similar way as Köhler et al. Has been used, but it can be a reference point to say, well, in the due course of writing this book, or when this book has been written, one of the conclusions was that this is something that should be developed more. Not necessarily because Machtel, Leo, and I wrote it, but also from the different chapters. In all different chapters, there are kind of opportunities and future research laid out of like, where should we go and where shall this go? And I think it's again the same as like, well, these authors have the power to police a bit, like, well, we think this would be interesting and we think this should be interesting. And it might be resonating with what you're doing or not, but it gives you the opportunity also to engage with that debate. And I think that's something that we hope to give it there. So maybe on finally, like also some of the challenges that we see ahead is like a bit, the first point is I think most important here, is that the rapid expansion of transition studies also has kind of the risk that each branch becomes its own field. And that we lose the links between empirical and conceptual work, but more explicitly that we do see, for like, to which extent are people across transitions really talking to each other, or is it the people taking different angles, know each other, understand that they are working on different elements, but are no longer in a real conversation and might not even read their own papers anymore, each other's papers anymore. giving back to other disciplines, and the social responsibility as STR enters education, funding, and policy. STR kind of as a field, or the scholars, they gain agency, but that also comes with some duties, and I think interesting to reflect on. Also has always been, I would say, the idea from middle range theories to kind of contribute here. So, but it also comes with some responsibilities on how to talk about it and how to engage with it. And that's something that will probably be an ongoing challenge. Not that this is going bad or something, but something being recognized as a challenge. So the final remarks is like we started kind of like with the trunk, with the roots, a field that grew around the turn of the millennium out of innovation studies, history of technology. Much of its early growth happening in the Netherlands, and we've spent most of our time kind of to look at how broad and how varied that growth has become. The whole book is about like, well, it has started there, but what's been done over the last year. And for me personally, it's also the reflexive turn is something that I think is really important, that we see a lot throughout the book. I would say like it's not net. I would say it makes sense that transition studies understand that we are part of the change that we're observing already for quite some time. So keep and be increasingly reflexive on what does it mean? What does it mean to talk about sustainability? What does it mean also to do research on this in the era that we're living? There is no neutrality in the work we're doing, as also one of the chapters that I wrote with colleagues from Ghent is present, and that makes for us really that makes for me something that transitions could continue to give into, like what is it that we're doing, and to think about that. Finally, I want to highlight again that without Julius, this would never have been here. He's been pushing through it a lot. So thanks for that to him, and we'll be in touch. My concluding remark for also to the ECRs, if I am in this opportunity to say something and maybe to give some advice, is to also kind of like use it really as an invitation to talk to the other people within the community. If you are at a university but not that much connected to the wider field of transitions, this is the book can be a very interesting starting point to start the conversation about these points. So thanks a lot. I think I run a bit over time, but those things happen, and I'm very curious to talk a bit more with you about it.